want to start my presentation by playing a little bit of a game with you guys. And when I say game, I just mean an interactive audience participation thing. So I know people hate audience participation, but just bear with me here. I'm going to give you two profiles. I'm going to give you some information about both of these profiles, and then we're going to try to work through together who each of these people may be. So profile A is a guy who was adopted into an American family. He dropped out of college after one semester. And after founding his own company in his parents' garage and about 15 years of booming success, he was actually fired from his own company. Any of these things ring a bell with anyone? Anyone you might be thinking of? Yeah?
Steve Jobs.
You know it's Steve Jobs. So profile A is Steve Jobs. Profile B is a little bit more outlandish, so if you don't know this one, it's okay, but he was born in North Carolina, very quiet and reserved. He was inspired by a traveling evangelist at the age of 15, but he was discouraged by his family, told that he should not pursue ministry because he would bring shame to their family. Anyone know who this might be? No idea on this one. It is the Reverend Billy Graham, so one of the most influential evangelists of our time, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people. See, both of these speakers were not born with golden tongues or influential words from birth. They endured hardship, just like you and I have. They faced resistance, and they overcame it to become great public presenters. So today, I want to explore two things with you. First, I want to examine the rhetoric of Steve Jobs and what makes him such a successful presenter. And second, I want to move on to look at Graham's life and see why he was such an influencer for Christ. What made him so great? So first, we'll delve into the speaking techniques of Steve Jobs and find out what contributes to his fascinating presentations as the former CEO of Apple. You should know up front, Walter Isaacson wrote this book. It's a biography about Steve Jobs' life. It's called Steve Jobs. And it describes how Jobs' life was a labyrinth of twists and turns. Like I said, from birth, he was adopted. He grew up, just wasn't really interested in the whole college scene, but he was interested in innovation and computational technology. And so he started this company in his parents' garage, known as Apple. As you can see, this very professional image that I've curated for you. And it was a booming success from day one, but it didn't change the fact that after about 15 years with his company, the creative team just didn't really align with what he was seeing. They saw two very different ideas of where they wanted the company to go, and so they just started to phase him out of the company in lower and lower positions until he was forced to just leave. And so Apple struggled on their own for about 13 more years, and then they rehired him in 1998. And you can see that based on this graph here, so Jobs came back in 98, and then all the way through his death in 2011, Apple's profit margin really starts to exponentially grow again. And then even after his death, 2012 through today, the company continues to peak higher and higher in their innovation. And that is because even after Jobs passed away, they continue to utilize his presentation format. So that begs the question, what is so exceptional about Jobs' presentation format? Well, Rebecca Ivik writes this article. She's a professor who teaches her students how to take on the persona of Steve Jobs. So she wrote this article about charismatic presentations called Developing the Persona of Steve Jobs. She says that when her students take on the persona of Steve Jobs, they develop and showcase qualities of charismatic presentations. So this will give you an idea where we're going, right? So purposeful eye contact. Each and every one of you. Vocal inflections, up and down, right? And compelling demonstrations, like pulling a MacBook Air out of a manila envelope. Things that people don't see coming. So I've made you a little to-do list to make it easier for you. What are three things that Jobs did that made him so great? Well, we talked about it in class. He practiced, and he practiced, and he practiced until he was fed up with it and didn't want to practice anymore, and then he practiced again. He also looked his audience in the eye. Guys, this one is really important as a great presenter. You want to do this because so often we're intimidated by our audience. We think our audience wants us to fail, but frankly, that's not the case. See, because if I'm fumbling around up here with my words, if I don't know what I'm doing, that makes all of you more uncomfortable, doesn't it? So our audience wants us to succeed too. You have to remember that they are people. They want to engage with you. They want to see you succeed. And third, Carmine Gallo, he is this influential author, life coach, motivational speaker, and he says that you have to know your content backwards and forwards. You have to know where you're going to start, where you're going to end, and every little word in between. Not that it has to be perfect, but you got to know the path you're taking. That's just common sense. So Jobs had a very one-dimensional impact, I'd say, just on the tech sphere, but when you compare him to Billy Graham really had a three-dimensional reach. He engaged the physical person, he got his people to listen, he engaged the emotion of a human being, and he really touched the soul. He engaged with the spiritual development of the human. So let's look at the great Reverend Billy Graham and what his techniques were, what made him such an influential speaker. He applied these techniques to the gospel, but we can apply them to all walks of life, anything that we might be speaking about. So Dennis Phelps is the director of the New Orleans Theological Seminary in New Orleans, and he wrote an article called 9 Things That We Can Learn from Billy Graham's Preaching. And so he listed a few. I've picked out the best for you. First of all, you have to include fresh illustrations. This one kind of goes along with that compelling demonstrations, but Phelps writes specifically, Graham often uses recent personal experiences without making himself the center or the hero figure. So Graham tells stories about himself, but he doesn't make it all about me, right? He's just a part of the story. And also, when using non-personal material, he's conscientious to give general attribution of the sources of quotes, statistics, and published material. So he uses not only stories about himself, but about other people. And when they're about other people, he makes sure to tell you where they're coming from. And that's so important. Your audience engages with stories. Humans love stories. We want to hear, we want to step in the footsteps or the shoes of that protagonist and just live out that story. So that's why it's such an important part of your presentation. So include those illustrations, engage your audience. Second, Graham offered an early appeal. And you might wonder what this means or why this matters. Pretty much, Graham told his audience what he expected of them and where he was going with his presentation. Again, people love a destination. We love to know where we're going. I took a road trip with my buddies this weekend. We didn't just hop in the car and dart in one direction until we decided to stop. We had an end goal. We had a point that we were getting to, and therefore, we could chill, we could enjoy the ride. And your audience is the same way. They need to know what you're expecting of them and where you're going, because then they're engaged in the now. They can listen to the words that you're saying, and you want them engaged with you with every single word that you speak. You want them hanging on to it. And third, this one's really interesting, guys, because this last one doesn't have to do with speaking at all. Third, Graham lived a life that was congruent with the message that he was preaching. It is so important that, much like Graham, we bring everything onto the stage with us. That being said, we're not soapboxing up there, but I think authenticity, vulnerability, and honesty with our audience actually builds credibility and trust. You might think it's the opposite, but people see where you are, they see that you come from a point of brokenness just like them, and then they're able to let their walls down and engage with you and hear where you're coming from. And so rather than being this great orator on stage and being this completely different person off stage, I think it's important that we are congruent and consistent in every aspect of our lives. So these were 2 very different presenters and speakers, but they taught us very different things. Jobs teaches us to think differently, and that we need to know our content backwards and forwards while we engage with our audience. But Graham teaches that vivacious stories will grab people by the shirt, a blueprint helps them to follow along with us, and that bringing the real, honest, and authentic version of ourselves helps us build trust with our audience. We could be the greatest speakers in the world, but it doesn't mean anything if it's all for show. Graham said it himself, you guys. What does it mean to gain the whole world if it means forfeiting your soul? See, we're learning how to tell stories in a way that people will want to listen. So before I conclude my presentation, I have to ask you guys one question, and I just want you to chew on this for a little while. You've all been given a passion or a story to tell, something that means a lot to you. So share it with people. And that being said, what has God put on your heart? What story has God given you that the world needs to hear, much like these 2 speakers had stories that the world needed to hear? Thank you guys so much for listening. I'm Carson.